welcome all to this COP26 event on driving net zero finance integrity, which my organization, Climate Policy Initiative, is proud to host together with UNEP FI and the 2 Degrees Investing Initiative. Our topic today is integrity. We have heard many announcements from financial institutions, including in the last week, most notably from the Global Finance Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ, announcing over $130 trillion of private capital is committed to transforming the economy for net zero, a welcome momentum for the financial sector. But what does that really mean? Are these institutions serious? What are the factors that will determine their success? How do stakeholders like the governments and civil society know if they're really making progress? And most importantly, will these commitments translate to emissions reductions globally? Integrity is about all these questions, and it's self-reinforcing. The more these commitments are shown to be serious and to have effects on the real economy, the more we can expect to happen. So I'm very pleased today to moderate this event here on driving net zero finance integrity. We will first start off with a presentation from the host organizations on some of the work being done to define, measure, and support integrity in the sector. Then we will move to a high-level panel of leading finance experts to discuss the questions we've raised. So without further ado, I will turn to Thibaut Ghirardi, who's Managing Director at 2DI France, who's joining us virtually, and to Raphaël Lebel, Head of the Sustainable Finance Observatory at Finance for Tomorrow, who is at the COP in Glasgow, for their presentation on operationalizing net zero commitments and monitoring progress. And then I'll present a couple of slides on CPI's own work in this area. So over to you, Thibaut, and please, if we can have the slides projected now.
Thank you very much, Bella. Can you hear me well?
Very well.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for this great introduction. I'm really excited to be part of this event today because, as you said, I think integrity is at the core of COP26. You said we heard about new pledges and new announcements recently. And I think everybody is asking now what will be the impact in the real economy. So if we move to the next slide, I think that's one key challenge for this COP will be to move from pledges to changes in the real economy. And more specifically, when we talk about financial institutions, I think the key question for the COP26 is what is financial institutions' contribution to the Paris Agreement? So as it explained in the next slide, we tried to answer this question last year already. We published a report that was named On the Road to Paris, in which we reviewed more than 2,000 commitments made by more than 1,000 financial institutions about climate change, trying to understand what is their contribution to the Paris Agreement. And the key takeaways were that we don't have enough information at this stage. We don't always know what will be the asset classes covered. More important, we, in most cases, don't know what will be the action that will be implemented to really support those commitments. And in a lot of situations, there is no ex-post impact tracking in the real economy. So it's not an easy question to answer, but we also have some great news. And as it's described in the next slide, we already know what are the key components for net zero pledges to be impactful and really lead to changes in the real economy. First, obviously, they need to be science-based and detailed enough to understand what the financial institution will do. Then they need to rely on impactful decarbonization plans this is not just about taking commitments, it's also about making them, implementing them in the real economy. And last, it's also really important for financial institutions to track and publicly disclose information about those commitments. So if we move to the next slide again, the second great news is that we also have tools to support financial institutions in taking impactful net zero pledges. I won't go into details, but just to quote a few. Most of you already know PACTA. This is the portfolio alignment methodology that we launched at 2DI, which can be used to understand what net zero means for financial institutions and portfolio level. We are also working with the French environmental agency, ADEME, around the methodology which is named ACT, and that can support financial institutions understanding what is the climate strategy of the underlying companies. We also launched recently this month a new report which is named the Climate Impact Management System, and which is basically a management system that can be used by financial institutions to set pledges and implement them in a way that can maximize their impact potential in the real economy, which is really, for me, the key objective. And last but not least, we also have in France the French Sustainable Finance Observatory, launched by Finance for Tomorrow, that will go global soon. And I will give the floor to my colleague Raphaël Lebel from Finance for Tomorrow to talk further about this.
Thank you, Thibaut. So yeah, how to track this transformation of the financial sector towards the sustainable goals and especially the climate goals? That's a question we had in France from after the COP21, and we worked a lot about that, and the French government and the financial center, the Paris Financial Center, worked together to launch this initiative, this Observatory of Sustainable Finance, which published data of this transformation. So what kind of data do we display? In one hand, you have the transformation of the practices and the flows. We publish data on ESG transformation. We publish data on all the investment for a low-carbon economy. And working with the banks, the insurers, the asset manager, all the specialists in finance, we work really with them to get data so we can get also data on the brand activities. And that is the more important data if we want to see if we are reaching the 1.5 degree. So, for example, for this year, for the first time, we publish the exposure of coal exposure for banks, insurance, and asset manager in France in this tool. And we are working on oil and gas exposure for the next years. So this is one kind of data. And the other data, we talked a lot about commitments. So what we've done in France is we aggregate all the commitments of financial sectors, and we are tracking them. We work with actors about how they are reaching their commitment, and we are doing analysis about this commitment. So all this information is in open data, it's free accessible, and that is important, we think, to have like a more global initiative and that all actors go forward. And we are doing that in the Sustainable Finance Observatory in France, but we are not alone. And CPI also launched an amazing tool, and I'm a little bit jealous for some part of it. The Net Zero Finance Tracker, I'm sure Bella is going to talk about it. And we are not the only one, and that's why the One Planet Summit, at the beginning of the COP, launched the One Planet Data Hub. The One Planet Data Hub it's a global initiative to make a global network engaging all this transparency initiative and to engage all this financial coalition to be more transparent and send the data to this global hub. So you will find all this transformational data in one place. This is the first step, and it's already a big step. And then the second step we want to work on it is to work on common definition of impact, common definition of transformational indicators, common alignment, so that we can make sure that all these commitments for net zero in global reach net zero for the humanity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thibaut and Raphaël. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about what we're doing at CPI, and thank you so much for your kind words about the Net Zero Finance Tracker. If we could just put up the slide deck one last time, just for 2 more slides. So at CPI, we're thinking about integrity in 2 ways. So first on this slide, we're thinking about it in terms of an overarching framework. So we've just released some work which is advised by a high-level group of financial system experts from around the world, as well as from both the public and private sectors, really seeking to understand what are all the coalitions committing to and how does that compare to what is needed, trying to provide a universal set of what we call guardrails to encourage ambition and give us something to track against. And then on the next slide, we are also developing methods to track progress towards net zero. So first, as Raphaël mentioned, we have released a beta net zero finance tracker, which is an interactive web dashboard to track the financial sector's response to climate change. So that uses 3 categories of indicators: targets, integration, and flows. And it provides assessments of progress towards decarbonization for various financial actor categories and for the real economy. It draws on 36 data sources from a variety of providers that contribute to over 200 individual metrics that we assess. And then in parallel to this effort on the right side of the slide, we're looking more deeply into individual financial institutions. So we conducted this year a thorough tracking and analysis exercise of publicly made commitments to address climate change for more than 350 private financial actors across 4 financial sectors. So we focused on institutions that have committed to net zero emissions by 2050 or otherwise systemically important actors. And we released that report along with a downloadable database last month and hope that you all will take a look and see. We're finding, of course, I think similar to what Thibaut and Raphaël are talking about, that the pace of commitments is increasing very rapidly, and now it's really down to the details. What will the targets include? How will they be implemented? So with that little bit of context on the issue of integrity, what we mean and what we're trying to get out of today, I would like to now transition over to the panel. I'm very, very pleased to welcome the following panelists to our discussion today. So first, we have Pierre Ducret, who's Special Advisor to the President of Finance for Tomorrow, who's joining us in person from COP in Glasgow. Next, we have Guido Fürer, who's the Swiss Re CIO and member of the UN-convened Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance Steering Group. He's joining us virtually. Then we have Chris Hurst, who's Director General of the Projects Directorate at the European Investment Bank. He's joining us in person from Glasgow. Next, we have Tracey McDermott, who is Chair of the UN-convened Net Zero Banking Alliance and the Group Head of Corporate Affairs, Brand and Marketing at Standard Chartered. And finally, we have Eric Usher, who heads the UN Environment Program Finance Initiative. And I understand that we are having a few technical difficulties with bringing those last 2 panelists, Tracey and Eric, into the room. So we will, of course, go to them last and hope that they are able to make it inside our virtual setting here. So let me start with a first round of questions around credible targets. So I'd like to hear from all of you, each of you, about the steps that organizations need to take to align their
We don't hear you anymore. We can guess.
Oh.
I guess what the question is.
Sorry, I think somebody muted me. So I am back. So let's go ahead and start the first round of questions about credible targets. So how the steps that organizations need to take to align their long-term net zero targets with credible 1.5C pathways. So I'm going to just give the order right now so everybody kind of knows when they're coming, but I'm going to start with Guido and then go to Pierre, Tracey, Chris, and Eric last, since he has not yet made it in, but I do see Tracey, so that's wonderful news. Welcome, Tracey. So let's start with Guido. So the Asset Owners Alliance was recently mentioned as gold standard by the UN Secretary General. I'm sure you're very proud of that. So can you tell us a little bit about why it's considered as such?
Thank you very much, Bella, for the question, but also for the presentation which you shared with us before, both from you, but also Thibaut and Raphaël. This is exactly what we need. We need kind of coming from different angle, remember and remind us how we basically jointly have this race to net zero. That's why much appreciated to see it from different angle, also from a data point of view, etc. Now, Swiss Re is I'd say, deeply committed in the net zero, not already this year, but I think since many years. And we always try to act as a role model in our industry, at least, but also we felt we are stronger when we find similar-minded peers. And that's why there was the great idea to have such an alliance. And again, Swiss Re was one of the co-founder with similar-minded investor. And it shows an alliance helps not only to get just better heard and recognition. I think the gold label, which, yes, we are super proud to have that recognition by the United Nations General Secretary. And I think the main differentiation is, yes, we have this net zero, but also we defined a very ambitious interim milestone. And the next one is already end of 24, beginning of 25. That's in 4 years. And that means all of us who are currently can direct some of the risk-taking or of the investment can impact, or actually should be held accountable if this is reached or not. And that was the result of a long discussion, believe me. Again, we have now a very nice number of members, started 5, but now we are considerably bigger, about 50 members. But to find kind of a good compromise, knowing not each company is on the similar pace or on the similar stage. That's why we came up with a range. And the range is between 16 and 29% reduction until 25 in respect of CO2 emission in our portfolios. And this gives a bit of space. And for us, I think this was a big achievement. But then also we were quite vocal what we need in reporting, what we expect from companies which we invest. There was also a kind of a working group looking how we engage. And I think it's not only committing to very ambitious target, but also basically making sure that we not just reach it ourselves as members, but we reach it in the real economy. And that's why it's nice to have target. And again, Swiss Re, we committed to another 35% reduction by 25. We already had a 30% reduction between 2015 and 2018. Now we do another 35. So we go beyond the range just to show how serious we are taking it, but also with the main idea showing it's possible. As we did the first 30, now we do another 35. And it's reachable, but the main piece, and I guess this is shared probably by many others as well, I can achieve it probably if I'm relatively strict and clear, but the most important thing is that the whole economy moves, and if I drop a certain investment, then most likely it will be taken up by someone else. That means it's a net effect, or the net zero effect for the real economy. That's why for me the engagement is so important. And companies which we invest, we have a very clear policy, what we expect from them, we monitor them, And coming back to the question, I think it's a combination of all the pillars and initiatives which we agreed on in the alliance, which make it somehow tangible, but also we commit ourselves and we publicly report about it, and that means there's no place to hide. Let's put it this way. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. That's a great, I think, a statement of ambition, a good place to start with the panel. So thank you for that, and some of the points you raised in particular on engagement and real economy, and we'll come back to in the second round to really try to dig into that a little bit more. So let me turn over to Pierre, who's in the studio. Very nice to see you. In your current role building the sustainable finance ecosystem of France, if I can say that, and your previous roles also in working with the French Public Pension Fund. So do you agree with the approach taken by the Asset Owners Alliance? Is there, how do you see kind of credibility in net zero targets?
Yes, I applaud the Asset Owner Alliance, of course, and but I'm no more into the Caisse des Dépôts, which is not exactly a pension fund, but let's say it's something like a French sovereign fund, to be very short. No, I'm here as you said as an advisor of Thierry Déot, the chair of Finance for Tomorrow, and Finance for Tomorrow is in fact representing the whole Paris Financial Center, French financial industry, in fact, in all its components. I mean, banking, insurance, asset management, and including the specific role of private equity. And this industry, this financial center, took a collective commitment in 2019 about aligning on net zero goal for 2050. Okay, and so what Raphaël showed in the beginning was in fact the way to prove and to get a credibility on this commitment collectively. And that's the reason why we made this building of an observatory with governance, aligning the financial institutions, the federations of insurance, banking, asset management, and so on. And also a scientific committee, including NGOs, and the dialogue between the scientific committee and the professional federations which are feeding the observatory is a kind of dialectic, which is each year feeding a very lively debate on the press about the main questions. Is it enough? Is it true? And so the observatory is a tool just to put some reality in this debate. And in fact, for me, the best tool to get it credible on a national basis. I will come back later because I think we have to be short in this first round of questions. But I will come back later on the fact that I think this kind of initiative that we had in Finance for Tomorrow is a very good example of is one piece of what we have collectively to build about credibility of the financial industry commitments. But I'll come back on that.
Great, thank you so much, Pierre. I think there's kind of 2 points that you mentioned. One is just this importance of data and really the tracking progress, which of course echoes how we started this event. The other that you mentioned was the scientific committee, and I know that's also something that the Asset Owners Alliance has really focused on is, the setting of science-based targets, really kind of looking at, for example, or focusing on the IPCC's no or low overshoot pathways, really making sure that that the pathways of finance are aligned with the the most kind of serious 1.5 scenarios. So really appreciate that that piece on connecting with science. So let me move to Tracey. So now the Net Zero Banking Alliance is a relatively, let's say, new kid on the block. It was announced in April. And so just very curious, how do you view the credibility of targets, both from your company as well as from the Alliance perspective? And what do you see as maybe some of the similarities and differences with the approaches of asset owners?
Thank you, and I hope you can hear me okay.
Can hear you very well, thank you.
Great, thank you. So, as you said, the NZBA is a relatively new organisation. We came into being in April of this year with 43 founder members, and we're now up to 95 banks across 39 countries with over 40% of global banking assets. So it's been a really rapid period of growth, which I think just demonstrates the seriousness with which the industry is now taking this issue. We may have been a little bit behind the asset owners, but there's certainly a lot of focus on this right now. And I think in terms of our overall approach, there's obviously, unsurprisingly, a number of similarities with the other alliances, particularly in relation to requiring high-level commitment, CEO-level sign-up, requiring publication of targets. So we've said within 18 months of signing up to NZBA, you have to publish targets. Obviously, they need to be science-based, and there has to be reporting on them. I think just picking up on one of the points made earlier, in terms of making sure that the targets are credible and aligned with real climate impact, we have to recognise that this requires business model evolution, and that's not just business model evolution for Standard Chartered Bank, but it's also business model evolution in the real economy. And we published our targets a couple of weeks ago for decarbonisation by 2030 with some really quite hefty percentage reductions. And that obviously is based on looking at the pathways, looking at how we can achieve decarbonisation, but at the same time supporting the need for a just transition. And clearly one of the key things there is around how we engage with clients, and that's not just engagement in a kind of how are you going to run the business, but actually really engaging in how we can support that transition. And that's one of the key roles that the banking sector can play, is how we finance the transition, because we know that there is going to need to be investment in order for companies to move away from current heavy emitting technologies into newer ones. I think the other thing I would say from a Standard Chartered perspective, we have been focused on this issue for some time. We've been reporting TCFD for a couple of years, and we were one of the original signatories to that. We are intending to report through our TCFD, our portfolio alignment levels, and also our absolute emissions levels, which we've published. But setting those targets, in terms of how you make it real, has to also translate into action. And so our own group scorecard, our long-term incentive plans have net zero components in them now, and we've also said that we will put our plans to an advisory vote of our shareholders next year. So there's a range of things to your question of how do you make this real. You have to recognise it needs business model change both within the organisation and outside, and you have to make it count, and you have to be transparent about it.
Great, thank you so much. I think that sort of echoes to the three kind of pieces of the framework that Thibaut presented at the beginning on having a target, how do you implement it, and how do you disclose it. And I think there certainly some other points that you made in terms of the outcomes, in terms of actual emissions reductions, that are quite important on the target setting an implementation process, as well as just having that near-term target, 2030, or in the case of the Asset Owners Alliance, 2025, to really drive those near-term reductions that are required to meet to be consistent with the 1.5C pathways. So thanks so much for that, and I will come back in the next round, especially on the topic of just transition, which I'm really glad that you brought up, and also financing the transition and what kinds of products and other kind of engagement practices you're working on. So when we get back, I will ask you a bit along those lines. So let me turn over to Chris Hurst now from EIB. So, the multilateral development banks, of which, the group of which EIB is a part, have jointly committed to Paris alignment and then developing and implementing the building blocks of that. And then EIB, I think, has been recognized widely as being out front in terms of the commitments you're making, including on key issues like fossil fuel financing. And so I'm curious, from your perspective and from kind of this public bank perspective, what does a credible target mean to you? How do you think about it?
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to participate here, and good evening, at least this evening here in Glasgow, to everybody. Well, I mean, we all know the scale of the problem, and there's absolutely massive amounts of investment which is needed. And Tracey just pointed out the importance of financial institutions in this flow of funds from savers into the right investments that will allow us to change our capital stock to clean technologies, and not to continue to keep investing in old 20th century technologies. I mean, what can an institution do about that? Well, every institution can develop its own strategy, and we have developed our strategy, which is what we call the Climate Bank Roadmap. What we've done is a series of steps. The first thing that we have done is to set standards on the projects that we invest. So we basically have three categories of projects that exist. There's those that make a positive contribution to the climate agenda. There's those that are not making a positive contribution but are good investments. But then we have standards to ensure that they do, in the terminology of the EU, do no significant harm. So we have minimum thresholds of investments that we would like to have. And then we have another set of investments that we would not continue to be associated with. And in this particular context, we would not be funding unabated fossil fuel projects anymore. So this is a clear decision that we've taken. But just looking at the project isn't sufficient. You also have to ask, who are you lending money to? Who is the counterpart? And if you take the trivial example, a windmill is a renewable energy project, is making a positive contribution, but not if it's powering a coal mine. So you have to then ask the wider context of the projects you're investing, and what is the promoter that you're funding doing with them. So just in fact this COP, we've launched what we call our PATH, which is the Paris-aligned framework for counterparts, and we would only now want to continue to invest in promoters and companies and other institutions that are actually following a pathway towards the zero emissions by 2050. So what do we do to ensure that? I mean, on the one hand, companies are complicated things, and it's very difficult to know exactly what they should be doing when. In fact, only they know what they should be doing when. But what we can ask them to do is to disclose what their targets are, and that they should have targets that are quantifiable and verifiable. In our particular case, we've said over the next 5 to 10 years, about how they intend to reduce their emissions. And we would also ask them to have longer-term plans to study the options they intend to pursue in the following decades to get to net zero by 2050. Now, if those targets are not following the science-based objectives, and we've taken a rough figure of a 4% reduction in emissions per year as a benchmark, if they're not following that downward path, then the company has to make a particular explanation about how they intend to catch up later. But it can be perfectly legitimate for a company to, in the first few years, the next 5 years, to reduce their emissions at a relatively slow rate, because they may do energy efficiency investments around existing technology, for example, but then in a later stage replace that technology with new green and efficient technology, and at that moment in time they're catching up for the slow progress they made in the early few years. But we can't know that, only the company can know that, but they have to disclose and explain, and that's the main objective we have, is to ask the companies to disclose and explain what these targets are, so stakeholders can see what they are and can engage with them if they so wish. What do we do with banks? I mean, we do quite a lot of business through banks, and lending to a bank is more complicated than lending to a business in this particular context, because the relationship with banks, with the companies they're lending to, can be broad and varied. So basically the approach we've adopted with the banking sector is that they should be disclosing along the lines of the TCFD requirements, so that so we can also see the extent, and they can disclose the extent that they're adopting the same kind of ideas and procedures that we have. So we're trying to quite cascade the obligation to the banking sector, if you like. So this is a new framework that we've just established now. I don't think we'll have to see if there's any issues in implementing it, but the key to the whole approach is that companies have to show that they understand the problems we face, they have to show that they've thought about it, and they have to work for their own sustainability at the end of the day. And in fact, it's in our own self-interest, as we're a bank lending long-term loans, it's important that we're not funding stranded assets, and we're funding companies and financial institutions that have a sustainable future. So it's in our own self-interest to pursue this as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. There was a lot of really rich information in there. I mean, just starting from your point on EIB, they're not funding on unabated fossil fuel anymore. I think that's, as everyone knows, is kind of consistent with what the IEA, the International Energy Agency, came out with earlier this year in their net zero roadmap. Saying that kind of activity, or that the cessation of that activity is necessary for 1.5C, and then kind of moving into not just from your own targets, but also, you know, what are the targets that you're looking for from your counterparties, both sort of direct corporate investment as well as financial intermediaries. So really interesting, and we will circle back to those points. So in the next session. So now I have the pleasure to call on Remco Fischer, who very kindly has stepped in for Eric Usher, who continued to have technical difficulties. So Remco Fischer works at UNEP FI as well, and has been involved in these issues for many years. So very happy to have you here with us, Remco. So you know, my question is really, given what you know about both what you just heard, but also, you know, what you know about what the Asset Owners Alliance is doing, what Net Zero Banking Alliance is doing, kind of, can you reflect a bit for us on you know, what target credibility means, and what kind of net zero targets should look like, and what they should include? Can you hear all right?
I can hear you, I think. I hope you can hear me too. I'm hearing, though, yes, things with a delay. So I'm still hearing you, but I see that you've stopped speaking. So we're having technical difficulties still. I'm going to put off the headphones, so I'm not continuing to hear you. But it's great to be with you, and apologies on behalf of Eric, who wasn't able to join us for technical reasons. Look, I'm going to be brief, to be honest, on this question, because Tracey and Guido have already covered really the basics of how in the 3 net zero alliances that now we, as UNEP FI with partners, facilitate and co-convene, what are the key features there that are meant to ensure targets, commitments, the promises, in other words, that are being made today are as credible as they can be. One, intermediary targets, we can quickly agree on that. Gold standard, AOA is 2025. The other alliances allow for targets to be, not to be set, but for targets to be achieved, attained by 2030. That's the latest. That, of course, is key. We can pretty quickly agree on that. Based and informed by the best available science, that is consistent across the 3 alliances. When we say best available science, we're looking at credible third-party authoritative modeling sources. Typically, that would boil down to the IPCC framework, so the body of scenarios coming out of the IPCC, but also the IEA. We consider that to be also a credible modeling source. We do then say across the alliances, this is not so much on credibility, but perhaps more on ambition. It needs to be, of course, scenarios that are 1.5 aligned with the ultimate temperature outcome goal of 1.5, but they also need to be no low overshoot. So we're really looking at the end of the spectrum of scenarios that, from an emissions pathway, is the most ambitious. And really the most conservative, one could say, from a perspective of climate safety and climate stability. Targets need to be quantitative. We're looking at emissions. Emissions are quantifiable, they're metrifiable. You can, of course, then look into absolute emissions intensities, etc. But we're looking at quantified targets, at metrics here, and those stand at the core of this. For instance, what we're not looking at so much in these targets, we're doing that a little bit here and there, and I think it's important, but that we're not focusing too much on process or on actions. So it's not about how many actions do you take or how many processes do you reform as a financial institution. It's really what's going to be the outcome and the result of that. And that's really the focus of what the targets are and have to be. Another key component is portfolios are large. They cover many geographies, they cover many asset types, they cover many sectors. What needs to be in scope, at least initially, of those intermediary targets? And it cannot be all portfolios, because for some asset classes, for instance, we don't even have the methods to do that. I'm thinking sovereign bonds here. I'm thinking things like cash and more structured assets, where we don't have the methods yet. But beyond that, for those asset classes where methods exist, those need to be included in a way that a significant majority of portfolio emissions, of course, are covered. And then a final bit that adds to credibility is, I think, a dual focus a little bit, to be looking at the total portfolio footprint, if you may, which reflects a little bit also the emissions of the entire economy, but they're also starting to look into sector-specific dynamics and also starting to set targets at portfolio level that are specific to sector and sector exposures. And all of those are boxes that these three alliances are ticking, and that speak, I think, to the credibility of the frameworks. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Remco, and always impressed to see you kind of jump into the panel and have a perfectly formed answer. So thank you so much for your thoughts on that. So let's move then from this point on kind of what makes a target credible. Clearly, we're at this place today where institutions are making commitments, figuring out kind of what that means, but we need to move quickly into implementation, and some of the speakers have already kind of started to address that. 1.5C pathways require significant reductions by 2030 at the latest. So I really want to spend this next round of questions kind of focusing on implementation. What are the key success factors that will allow the implementation of these net zero targets, both those that you control and maybe some that that you need to work with others on? So I'm going to go in this order. So first with the banks, with Chris, and then Tracey, and then Pierre, and then Guido, and then finally Remco again to help us kind of summarize a bit the discussion. So now over to you, Chris, again from EIB. So you've made a few announcements in the last weeks, an announcement of an emerging market climate action strategy with Allianz, these counterparty alignment guidelines that you just talked about. And they're really getting at a few kind of key factors in implementation and investment for transition, especially in developing countries, as well as engagement. So I'm just, how do these and other initiatives exemplify your implementation strategy? What will facilitate your achievement of it? I'm kind of just curious to know, when you go out and talk to companies and to financial intermediaries, what do they say when you're telling them to kind of that they need to do X, Y, or Z?
I mean, many companies are already doing this, right? And we have a lot of companies that are already very aware of the problems we face. And there are companies that maybe are lagging behind, but we try to engage with those companies and and if necessary to help them. We have maybe in some cases we can have access to technical assistance monies that we could provide to help companies also to develop these frameworks, and in fact banks as well. And for that matter, we're talking here outside the EU rather than inside the EU. I think the key well, there are two keys, I think. One is transparency and information, which we've talked about already, because consumers will follow sustainable products. So when that data and information is available, there will be naturally a flow of consumer interest to those areas, which will make those projects more bankable and which will make it easier for financial institutions such as my own to be involved. However, we still need to have public-private partnerships in order to get the amount of money flowing that we need to a developing country context. Whatever we're doing, these projects are going to remain risky because the technologies are still not as mature as they may be in some instances. The environment that they're being operated in may also has its uncertainties. So we need to have the money from the public sector to be blended with that from the private sector, including ourselves, in order to de-risk these investments, to make them a proposition for people who would like to be involved in that sector. And as you go into more difficult environments, the more public money you need to underpin those type of investments. So I think what is key to all of this is the partnerships between the various people that are involved. And we already have involved in many funds, for example, where we have public sector involvement at one layer in the fund. We're in a different layer of the fund, and private sector investors are involved in a different layer in the fund as well. So this is a way in which we can have a large multiplier effects on small amounts of public money, and to try to get the amounts flowing that we need to see. And that is critical, I think, in a developing country context.
Thank you so much, Chris, for kind of kicking us off on implementation, and I think especially on this kind of transition investment. Maybe over now to Tracey, just continuing on the thread of banks. You know, how does what Chris is facing resonate with you as a commercial bank with the Net Zero Banking Alliance? And, you know, what do you think is going to be really needed to, you know, how are banks going to implement these, the commitments they're making? What are going to be some of those key factors from the commercial side?
Yeah, so I think everything Chris has said I would agree with, particularly the need for public-private partnership and the need to work with companies, particularly in emerging markets and developing economies, because there is there's an appetite to want to do this, but there's also a reality of the current landscape in those markets, a reality of where current power, for instance, comes from, and a reality of the need to support social development and economic development. So I think public-private partnerships and thinking of ways to sort of make projects bankable is a really key part of this. I think the having an appropriate regulatory and policy framework in the broader context is also a critical enabler, because there is the real risk, if you're not careful, that you could have unintended consequences from policy or regulatory changes, which actually, particularly for emerging markets and developing countries, actually moves capital away rather than towards them, because it becomes much easier to invest elsewhere. And there's obviously a broader policy question as well around carbon and carbon prices, rather. I mean, I think one of the things, just in terms of implementation, from looking at it from a bank's perspective and looking at this very much through the Standard Chartered lens, Remco made the point that, in terms of targets, we're not interested from an NZBA perspective in processes and policies. We're interested in targets that are quantitative and that can be measured and reported against. Unfortunately, within the bank, the implementation, a lot of that is about process and policy. It's about how do you incorporate this into the way you assess risk in a project? How do you incorporate that into your reporting mechanisms? How do you incorporate that into the way you train your people? How do you incorporate that into remuneration and so on? So there's actually a very, very big operational element to how you make a net zero commitment real in terms of translating through, starting with data, but actually all the way through into how you, as I said, how you remunerate your staff. And there are some real challenges here in implementation, and I think we have to be very honest about the challenges. One of those challenges is around data and the lack of consistent data and the lack of consistently available data. The scenarios that have been published to date are not sufficiently granular to just pick up and take away. We have a very rapidly evolving policy landscape. Sector pathways are still evolving. Remco mentioned there are areas where there's no methodology yet in terms of how we set targets. So there's a huge amount of work that still needs to be done in terms of that framework. And I guess the one of the risks is that we allow the best to be the enemy of the good. And my message would be that I think we just need to get started. We at Standard Chartered published our methodology. We published a white paper that's 30-odd pages long, setting out exactly how we've approached this, because we know that there are limitations in what we've done. We want to be transparent about those. We think that over time those will be cured, but we actually think that by doing that in an open way and sharing that, we can bring together, and this is one of the big benefits of the alliance and the NZBA for banks in particular, is that you can bring together that knowledge and experience and share that learning, recognizing that no one has the perfect answer yet.
Thank you, Tracey. If it's all right, I'm going to ask you a follow-up actually before we move on. I mean, I think sort of connecting to a few things. So first, in the first round, you talked about just transition, and here you talked a bit about developing countries, some of actually potential for unintended consequences. And I'm just curious, how can we kind of bring in developing country financial institutions and banks, into these types of alliances? Because I think they're so far kind of relatively underrepresented. And, how do you, maybe kind of a corollary question is, how do you measure, what do you do about just transition? How do you bring that into your bank and really kind of operationalize that concept?
So the two separate questions. So in terms of the emerging markets in developing countries, we do have a number of signatories to the NZBA who are from those countries. So, Kenya, Latam, various places. But I think it is fair to say that the preponderance of people are from, or preponderance of organizations are from more developed countries. So we are very keen to ensure that we are as broad a church as we can be and that we get those voices into the room, because I think it's critical both for upskilling and sharing knowledge, but also for making sure that the policy environment doesn't, as I said, inadvertently cut off capital to the places that need it the most. In terms of how you measure just transition, I mean, one of the first things I think is it's almost when you look at the pathway and when you look at the scenario Chris talked earlier about the fact that, you need to be transparent about what your targets are and how you're going to achieve those. I think we also need to be transparent about recognizing that the pathway for sub-Saharan Africa may be different from the pathway from Indonesia, which may in itself be different from the pathway for the UK and the Netherlands. So the first component of the just transition from our perspective is saying, actually, what is the right pathway to look at? And that requires you to look at both the industry sectoral pathways, which there's a lot of focus on, but I think increasingly also what are the geographic pathways? Because how do you make sure that you are supporting economic and social development, but at the same time ensuring that that isn't at the cost, the same emissions cost as has been our own economic and social development in the West. So I think that's the key element of it in operationalization, is saying, okay, what do we think that pathway needs to look like, recognizing that some of those markets will have fossil fuel dependency for longer than the UK, for instance, where we can move much more quickly.
Great. Thank you so much, Tracey, and thanks for sort of being willing to entertain my extra questions to you based on what you were talking about. So let me move over to Pierre, kind of again representing this French ecosystem and this collective goal in France. I mean, what are you thinking about with implementation? What are the barriers that the different organizations that you work with face? You know, how are you working to overcome those?
First, excuse me, but allow me just to say hello to Remco, because I didn't see him for a long time, so I'm very happy to have him in the panel. But more seriously, what are the main barriers? I think that things are different depending on the different parts of the financial industry. It's not the same difficulties for banks and for asset managers and so on. There is a common difficulty, which is the lack of data coming from the real economy to the financial sector, and of course the fact that the tools and the methodologies are not for the moment sufficiently developed and common. So I think that those are very important barriers for the progress. And I would like to add something that I began to say on the first round of questions, that I think that one thing which is really at stake now is to build together globally a comprehensive MRV, monitoring, reporting, verification system dedicated to the process of alignment of the financial industry on the net zero goal. That is to say, the MRV system of the Article 2C of the Paris Agreement and so on. And I think it's time to do it. And we have a lot of pieces of this comprehensive system. We have powerful alliances in the G-funds construction, you know. We have a very important piece of soft law, which is the TCFD. We have pieces of hard regulation coming from Europe mainly, and also of supervision. And so there is a top-down push to organize all that. And in fact, we have the data coming from the financial industries. If there is a problem of a lack of data, it's from the real economy toward the financial industry, but not on the financial industry itself, where the data are almost, on my opinion, available, you know. And so we can build all that. And it means that we have to track the reality of the shift, and to track it on different levels. Avoiding double counting. That means that we have to do it for the different types of sectors of the financial industry. For example, beginning by making the separation between the public sector and the public finance, and including GFIs, MDBs, and so on, and the private sector. Our job in Finance Tomorrow is much more to participate to this construction about the private sector. And I think that it needs a very, I would say that, demanding work of tracking on different levels, and something which is very difficult is to have it simple enough, at the end of the day, simple enough to be understood by the civil society, by the common people, who are not especially specialists in finance, you know. And so that's the problem, because to come back to the question of credibility, we have to remember that we have to speak to convince the citizens and the consumers that effectively the finance industry is transforming itself. And so when I say that it's a complete construction, it means that, and at different levels, we need something, an overarching consolidation. Probably what you are doing Bella, with the TPI, with the net zero finance tracking is something which I understand the ambition to build something which would be the overarching part of this MRV system, and I applaud to it. I think we can share it, and I think we need also something which is much more bottom-up, coming from the different financial centers. And mainly when I say the different financial centers, the financial centers of the developed world, which are representing a huge part of the capital market, you know. So I think if we succeed in doing that for the OECD countries, it will be already a great job to organize this MRV system. And it needs to be really reliable, and so resulting in a dialogue between the financial institutions themselves who are committing and so on, and observers, scientific think tanks and so on, which must keep their capacity to criticize, in fact, the data and the figures we will come through this, into this system.
Thank you so much, Pierre. And I think, yeah, both talking about sort of some of the data inputs and methodologies that aren't necessarily sufficient, but then sort of on the other side, kind of building this MRV system for Article 2.1c, which is about alignment of the financial systems with the goals of the Paris Agreement, and really being able to track that at different levels. Really interesting kind of points around data in the context of implementation and also in a measurement of progress. So let me move over to Guido. So I was really interested and excited to hear, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance already has this 16 to 29% goal by 2025, but it sounds like Swiss Re has kind of already reduced that and now is reducing, has pledged another 35%. So just very curious about how what you see as the ingredients for reducing your portfolio emissions. And I think ideally if you could also talk about kind of the connection with the real economy and how you can make those reductions, both, the portfolio reductions, but also actually how you understand whether that translates into real economy change as well.
These are excellent questions, Bella, and it's fair to say it's learning by doing, and we started with the flipping the portfolio into ESG full speed in 2017, and at that point in time, of course, all the data and what we discussed today was probably even more challenging. But for me, it's important that you start. And not to wait for all the fair and important input framework, etc. And nowadays, in my view, it's advanced enough to really kind of move quick. And this is my first point out of 4, which I want to make on the implementation. One is speed, and I'm clearly in the camp. If you can reduce whatever 1 ton today, this is a much higher value than if I move the same ton in 2040. That's why speed. We also call it race to zero. It's about speed, and that's why if we debate too long what is missing, we miss a very important window in the market. That's why speed. And the other one is, and this is also linked a bit to your question, how we make sure that the real economy is taken forward. We don't exclude any sector. That's important with our approach. We are somehow sector agnostic. What we do within the sector, we look who are the most convincing issuer. And most convincing is, yes, someone has a plan, a strategic plan, how to reach the ambitious target, and is willing to report on it, on progress. And that's why, for me, finding a role model within the sector, helping the others that it's possible. And this is a bit our approach. In insurance sector, I think we are probably relatively advanced. We started early, and now we put ourselves ambitious target on it. Swiss Re itself will not make a big difference. I'm completely aware of, but this role model, it's important. In each sector, you need to find those. And the other one is who makes the day-to-day decision? And I think each investor, each bank has to think about that the message arrives where it has to arrive. And in my case is the portfolio manager, she or he makes a decision which constituents, which issuer is the more attractive one. And that's why you have to make sure that the framework is the right one, the incentive one. And that's why we work with ESG benchmark. Since 2017, and from a practitioner point of view, this was the most important decision which I have done in my professional career. And everyone knows the importance of benchmark, and we have environmental focused benchmark. If you pass them to the portfolio manager, you see a completely different, interest, action point, and result. And last point is this was, I think, mentioned rightly so by all of the speaker, is the monitoring. Or if something is green today at issue, is it still green in a year's time? We do every year. I look each so-called green investment, check it. Is it still green or not? If it's not green, I reallocate it. And this gives a discipline, both on the investor side, but clearly also on the issuer side. And then the more voices which we have who help the real economy, to show the importance, but also that the real economy actually is tracked, this is monitored, and based on reporting which we all understand. And we introduced again TCFD, which was mentioned 2016, and we report our reduction and expect the same from the company where we invest in. And that's why the implementation is possible. Coming back, speed is for me probably the main message which I wanted to share with you.
Thank you, Guido. It's quite pragmatic to think about, just start, the methodologies, the data, the information won't be perfect. I think that's, actually familiar for the people in the finance sector. But you just got to get going. And I think some of the particular ways of doing that were quite interesting, in particular around incentives within performance incentives within the company, which is something I think that is very operational and very much needed. So let me turn over to Remco now to give us any thoughts that you have on implementation, as you've been working with many of the alliances and companies and financial institutions in your role.
Thanks again, Bella. And I'm not hearing you double anymore, which is a lot easier than now to follow you and the other panelists. Very good to see you again, Pierre, as well, and of course Guido and Tracey as champions, all of you in this agenda. On implementation, what I want to say is a little bit what we have in mind in terms of, as financial institutions now over the next years and decades carry out this journey, what are the things that they have to have on the radar screen? I think that this is the way I picture it. And clearly, one of the things that they have to have on the radar screen is the science. Everyone says it's science-based, it's scenario-based. We need to follow the science. This is the big paradigm shift at the moment, and it is. And so I think we need to do that, and or the financial institutions rather need to do that. And I think more and more, we need to start translating the global models that we have, that very often are economy-wide, to sector-specific pathways. What does, and it's happening. It's happening, but we need to have it more happen, so that also when investors and financial institutions are then looking at their sector exposures and working with their clients and position companies and portfolio companies, they're able to say, well, for that particular sector, what's the science telling us about how that sector needs to decarbonize, at what speed, at what magnitude, et cetera. So I think they need to do constantly a science check, because all of this is meant to be science-based. But then there's no way financial institutions as influential and powerful they can be in economies there is no way that the finance sector alone or financial institutions alone can actually achieve these decarbonization, the steep decarbonization decreases, especially those that are associated with 1.5 no overshoot that I mentioned at the beginning. That is really, really ambitious. That is serious stuff. There's no way they can do this alone. And that's why they have to also do continuously a reality check. Reality check with the companies on their portfolios, with the business industry associations that represent those companies, with the leading minds in those sectors, with the leading champions, Guido, to your point, who are the most innovative, the most ambitious actors on cement, on mobility, on aircraft, on air travel, etc., and have a sense of what do they think is feasible in terms of decarbonization pathways. And I think the science check and the reality check will show there's a gap. In all likelihood, there's no way, industry at this moment thinks, 1.5 low overshoot is feasible. There's going to be a gap. And then I think what happens, and I think this is where the magic really begins at implementation, is the financial institutions now knowing that gap can, together with the portfolio companies in the sectors, then probably just describe what is needed to close the gap. What new regulations are needed for the sector, what new regulations are needed economy-wide. Is the carbon price not high enough? Are the fossil fuel subsidies still flowing? Are we not subsidizing enough breakthrough technologies? What do we need to close the gap? And then with that information, of course, they can engage the portfolio companies and together financial institutions, whether it's an institutional pension fund, an insurance company, a bank, or a utility in the real economy, hopefully they might then be able to make a case to the regulator and to the policymaker. There's a gap. We need you, to help us close that gap because market forces alone will not be able to close it fully. So I think that's one thing that I wanted to share in terms of different things on the radar screen and how they need to come together. The second thing I wanted to mention is, of course, there is within the toolkit of financial institutions, there are various tools, and one is engaging, and we can all agree, and that can be, as I said, engaging companies, but it can also be engaging other parts of the investment value chain. It can also mean engaging sectors through business industry associations. It can mean engaging governments and policymakers. But there's the big engagement toolbox, and most people will agree that's if engagement is successful on carbon, that's the most immediate way to achieve impact in the real economy. It's the most immediate way because engagement will then lead to board decisions of companies, and it will lead to immediate capex and whatnot, and then emissions will go down. But then, of course, we need to ask the question: what if engagement isn't enough? And in many instances, it might not be enough. After years or after decades of engagement, what can a net zero financial institution do? And I do think that I don't want to say divestment because it's a divestment is really connotated, into a really specific corner. But capital reallocation needs to be able to play a role in this toolkit. It's perhaps not the first measure, but it should somehow be considered, I think, the measure of last resort, especially if all other engagement efforts remain futile. And I don't think that capital reallocation, especially along the lines of what Guido has, is proposing, when the sectors remain the same, I don't think that has no impact. I think the impact might be a bit less direct, or a lot less direct than with engagement, but it can be very systemic through cost of capital type dynamics. It can really send strong signals back into the real economy that the financial economy is now taking this seriously, and so I do think that as financial institutions implement all of this, there's a continuum of engagement and capital reallocation, and I think that whole continuum needs to be mobilized and used. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Remco. So I have been notified that we have absolutely to keep to our time. So we just have 2 minutes left. So I think I will skip the last round just to make sure that we do finish on time. So I am just going to give a big thank you to both the presenters, Thibaut and Raphaël, as well as to all of the panelists, Pierre, Chris, Remco, Tracey, and Guido, for your participation today. I think this has been an incredibly rich discussion about finance integrity and what it will really take to get to net zero 2050 net zero, but what that means for actually, what do we need to do today? And I think the people on the panel here with us today are really kind of exemplifying what that means, and are leading in that area and really kind of helping to show the way forward. And I think maybe I will just end kind of reiterating what I heard from both Guido and Tracey, which was you just have to start. You have to start now, and it is imperative to do so. So thank you all so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it again, and especially to our co-organizers, 2DI and UNEP FI as well. Have a wonderful rest of the day and safe travels home for everybody in Glasgow.